A wealthy merchant stood on the deck of his ship, watching everything he owned disappear beneath the waves. He was 22 years old. His cargo, his wealth, his entire future, gone. Most men would have been devastated. Zeno of Citium looked at the wreckage and said something strange. "You've done well, Fortune, driving me thus to philosophy." That shipwreck in 312 BC didn't just change one man's life. It accidentally created a philosophy that would shape Roman emperors, influence early Christianity, and become the foundation of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. The merchant who lost everything in the Mediterranean became the man who taught the world how to lose everything and remain unshaken. But here's what nobody tells you about Stoicism's founder. He wasn't Greek, he wasn't a natural philosopher, and his first teacher made him carry a pot of lentil soup through Athens just to humiliate him in public. The story of how an outsider from Cyprus became Athens' most respected teacher is stranger than the philosophy he created. Citium in 334 BC was a contradiction, which makes perfect sense for the birthplace of a man who would build a philosophy around accepting contradictions. The city sat on the southern coast of Cyprus, a major port where Greek settlers lived alongside Phoenician merchants and local Levantine populations. Everyone traded with everyone. Greek temples stood near Phoenician shrines. Multiple languages filled the markets. Zeno was born into this mixed world right when Alexander the Great ascended the throne in Macedonia. We don't know the exact date. Ancient record-keeping wasn't concerned with that kind of precision. What we do know is that his father, Minucius, was a merchant who regularly travelled to Athens. The name Minucius itself tells you something about the family's cultural position. It works in both Phoenician, where it means one causing to forget, and Greek, where it means mindful. So, complete opposites. His father existed between two worlds. The name they gave their son didn't have that ambiguity. Zeno refers to Zeus, the Greek god. No Phoenician meaning, no hedge, just a clear signal about which cultural tradition they were choosing. Onasius may have made that choice deliberately. He lived through Citium's final years, under Phoenician rule, watching as Ptolemy Soter of Egypt besieged and burned the city in 312 BC. The same year Zeno would arrive in Athens. Sometimes a name is a statement about the future you want, rather than the past you inherit. We know nothing about Zeno's childhood. His mother's name doesn't survive in any ancient source. No stories about his education, no anecdotes about precocious philosophical insights. He grew up in a merchant household, learned the family business, and became wealthy doing it. That's the extent of our knowledge. What's clear is that young Zeno was good at commerce, really good. By his early 20s, he'd accumulated substantial wealth through trading. He understood ships and cargo, knew the Mediterranean routes, could negotiate in multiple languages. He was set for a comfortable life as a successful merchant, following his father's path, probably planning to pass the business to his own children someday. Then the ship went down. The details are sparse. We know he was 22, travelling from Phoenicia to Piraeus, Athens port. Some accounts say he was carrying purple dye, a luxury good that would have been worth a fortune. The ship wrecked, Zeno survived, everything else didn't. What happens next sounds almost too perfect, like one of those origin stories that gets polished by centuries of retelling until it shines with mythic significance. Zeno washed up in Athens with nothing. No cargo, no wealth, no plan. He wandered into a bookshop, because apparently that's what you do when you've just lost everything and don't know what else to do. The bookseller was reading aloud from the Xenophon's Memorabilia, a collection of conversations with Socrates. Zeno stood there, dripping seawater probably, and listened. The portrait of Socrates fascinated him. Here was someone who owned nothing, questioned everything, and seemed genuinely happy. Someone who'd found a way to live that didn't depend on ships staying afloat or cargo reaching port. Zeno asked the bookseller a question that would redirect the rest of his life. Where can men like Socrates be found? Timing is everything. Just then, Crates of Thebes happened to walk past the shop. Crates was the most famous Cynic philosopher in Athens, a living embodiment of Socratic principles taken to their radical extreme. The bookseller pointed, "Follow that man." According to the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius, Zeno looked at his situation, shipwrecked, broke, standing in a bookshop in a foreign city, and made a joke. "Now that I've suffered shipwreck, I'm on a good journey." Another version has him saying, "You've done well, Fortune, driving me thus to philosophy." Think about that response for a moment. Most people would be panicking, trying to figure out how to rebuild their wealth, send word to family, arrange passage home. Zeno saw the disaster as redirection, not just accepting it, but interpreting it as fortune, capital F, doing him a favour by destroying his old life so he could find a better one. That's not Stoicism yet. He hasn't developed the philosophy, but the seed is already there. This instinct to reframe catastrophe as opportunity, to find the good use for the bad thing that just happened. He followed Crates, and that's where things got weird. The Cynics weren't like other philosophical schools. They didn't have buildings or formal lectures. They lived in public, demonstrating their philosophy through their lifestyle. The word cynic comes from the Greek word for dog, because critics said they lived like animals. No shame, no social conventions, no concern for what others thought. Crates was the real deal. He'd inherited a fortune and given it all away to live in voluntary poverty. He owned one rough cloak, carried a staff and a bag for begging. He slept wherever. He said whatever he thought, did whatever he wanted, and didn't care who was watching. His wife Hipparchia was equally committed. She'd rejected wealthy suitors to marry Crates and adopt the Cynic lifestyle. Together, they were Athens' most visible philosophical couple. And visible is the key word because Cynics believed in practicing their philosophy in public. Zeno became Crates' student. The ancient sources describe him as showing a strong bent for philosophy, though with too much native modesty to assimilate Cynic shamelessness. That's a polite way of saying Zeno was temperamentally unsuited for public displays that violated every social norm. There's a story from Apuleius that illustrates the problem. Crates and Hipparchia decided to have sex in public, not to shock people, though they definitely did that, but because Cynics believed that anything natural and good shouldn't need to be hidden. A crowd gathered. Zeno, seeing what was happening, rushed over and covered the couple with his cloak to shield them from the crowd's view. Crates must have found this hilarious. Here was his student trying to protect him from the very thing he was deliberately doing. Zeno couldn't help himself. He cared too much about social expectations, about propriety, about what strangers thought. The lentil soup incident makes this even clearer. As part of his training, Crates told Zeno to carry a pot of lentil soup through the streets. Just carry it. Walk through Athens with everyone watching. Zeno did it. Hated every second, but did it. Then Crates walked up and smashed the pots with his staff. Lentil soup exploded everywhere, covering Zeno in front of the whole city. Zeno ran. Crates called after him, "Why run away, my little Phoenician? Nothing terrible has befallen you." That nickname, my little Phoenician, is interesting. Crates was highlighting Zeno's outsider status, his non-Greek background, but he was also making a point. You're ashamed because of what these Greeks think. Why do their opinions matter? Nothing terrible happened. You got wet, your clothes got dirty. And Zeno never fully adopted Cynic shamelessness. He remained, according to ancient sources, earnest and gloomy in disposition, preferring small groups to crowds, investigations to performances, substance to show. But Crates taught him something crucial. Most of what we fear is just other people's judgment, and other people's judgment has no real power unless we give it power. After studying with Crates, Zeno broadened his education. He worked with Stilpo, a philosopher from the Megarian school, then with the dialecticians Diodorus Cronus and Philo, learning formal logic and argumentation. then with Xenocrates and Polemo, studying Platonist philosophy at the academy. This is unusual. Most philosophers stayed within one tradition. Zeno was shopping around, extracting useful elements from each school. From the Cynics, virtue is the only good, live according to nature, strip away unnecessary conventions. From the Megarians, logical rigor, precise definitions, careful argumentation. From the Platonists, systematic philosophy, the importance of studying the cosmos, the connection between ethics and metaphysics. He spent about 10 years doing this, 10 years learning from Athens' best teachers while living on almost nothing. Ancient sources describe his lifestyle during this period: haggard, lean, dark-skinned from hours in the sun. He ate food that didn't require cooking, mostly raw vegetables and green figs, which he apparently loved. He wore thin clothing even in winter. He declined most dinner invitations. He lived like someone who genuinely stopped caring about comfort or status. But unlike Crates, Zeno's asceticism wasn't a performance. He wasn't trying to shock anyone. He was just living simply because that's what made sense to him. No possessions meant no anxiety about losing possessions. No fancy meals meant no dependence on fancy meals. The less he needed, the less fortune could take away. People noticed Athens was full of philosophers, but Zeno stood out, partly because of his appearance, that dark skin and foreign look in a very Greek city, partly because of his intensity. Ancient sources say he was fond of burying himself in investigations, spending hours working through logical problems or thinking through ethical questions. He was building something. You can see it taking shape. The Cynic insistence that virtue alone matters, refined by Megarian logic, grounded in a Platonist worldview. Not quite cynicism, too systematic, too concerned with rational foundations. Not quite Platonism, too focused on practical ethics, too dismissive of elaborate metaphysics. Something new. Around 301 BC, after roughly a decade of study, Zeno started teaching his own philosophy. He was 33 years old. He didn't rent a building or establish a formal school in the traditional sense. Instead, he chose a public space, the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch. The Stoa Poikile was a colonnade on the north side of Athens' Agora, the civic centre. It was substantial, big enough to hold 500 people, with an open colonnade facing south toward the Acropolis. The walls were decorated with paintings of mythological and historical battles. It was public space, accessible to anyone. There's a detail here that matters. Apparently Zeno chose this location deliberately to restore tranquility to the Stoa, where 1,400 people had been murdered during an earlier period of political violence. He was reclaiming a space associated with death and trauma, turning it into a place for philosophical discussion. He would walk up and down the colonnade, talking. No prepared lectures, no rigid structure. Just Zeno pacing, thinking aloud, responding to questions, working through arguments. People started gathering to listen. They sat on the steps, stood in the colonnade, followed him as he walked. They called themselves Zenonians at first, but eventually, because they met at the Stoa, they became known by a simpler name. The people from the porch, Stoics, that's how it started. A shipwrecked merchant from Cyprus, too modest for cynicism, but too radical for conventional philosophy, pacing back and forth in a painted colonnade, building a system of thought that would outlast empires. But what was he actually teaching? That's where it gets interesting, because Zeno's Stoicism was more radical than most people realise. The philosophy Zeno taught wasn't written down at first. No textbooks, no systematic treatises, just conversations in a colonnade, arguments refined through repetition, ideas tested against student objections. We know about his teachings mostly from later sources, from students who wrote about his views, from critics who argued against them. The details come to us filtered through centuries of interpretation. But the core system is clear enough. and it's stranger than the watered-down Stoicism you might have encountered in modern self-help books. Start with this. Zeno divided philosophy into 3 parts: logic, physics, and ethics. The division itself wasn't new. He borrowed it from the academy, but the way he connected these 3 domains was distinctive. They weren't separate subjects. They were aspects of a single unified system. Logic came first, not because it was most important, but because you needed it as a foundation. How do you know what's true? How do you distinguish reliable impressions from illusions? Zeno had studied with dialecticians, people who specialized in logical arguments and tricky paradoxes. He'd learned to be precise about knowledge. He introduced a concept he called catalepsis, cognitive grasp, the idea that certain impressions carry their own guarantee of truth. When you perceive something clearly and distinctly, when the impression comes from something real and accurately represents that thing, you can grasp it with certainty. Zeno supposedly demonstrated this with hand gestures. An open palm represented an impression. Fingers beginning to close represented assent, agreeing that the impression seems true. A closed fist represented catalepsis, certain knowledge, grasping truth so firmly it couldn't be pulled away. This mattered because Zeno was fighting on 2 fronts, against skeptics who said you couldn't know anything for certain, and against dogmatists who claimed knowledge without proper justification. He needed a middle ground. Some things can be known with certainty, but only if you meet specific criteria. The criteria were strict. An impression had to be 1. From something real, 2. Accurately stamped and moulded according to that real thing, and 3. Of a kind that couldn't come from something unreal. That 3rd clause was added later to close a loophole, but it shows how carefully Zeno was thinking about epistemology. Why does this matter for a system focused on how to live? Because if you can't trust your perceptions, you can't make good decisions. If you mistake an unreliable impression for certain knowledge, you'll act on false information. The wise person needs to know what they know and what they merely think they know. This connects to physics, the second part of the system. And Stoic physics was weird. Zeno was a materialist. Everything that exists is physical. There are no Platonic forms floating in some transcendent realm. No immaterial souls separate from bodies. Everything is matter in various configurations. But, and this is crucial, Zeno's matter wasn't inert, dead stuff. It was alive, rational, organized by an active principle he called pneuma or logos. Think of it like this. Reality has 2 aspects, passive and active. The passive aspect is basic matter, stuff that can be shaped. The active aspect is reason, the organizing principle that shapes it. But these aren't separate entities. They're 2 ways of describing the same unified reality. Matter without organization would be chaos. Organization without matter would be nothing. You need both. The cosmos itself is rational, not metaphorically, literally. The same reason that operates in your mind when you think clearly operates throughout the universe, organizing everything, ensuring nothing happens randomly. Zeno argued this in a compact syllogism. Whatever produces rational beings must itself be rational. The universe produces rational beings. Therefore, the universe is rational. This wasn't wishful thinking. It was Zeno's attempt to ground ethics in nature itself. If the universe operates according to reason, and humans possess a share of that universal reason, then living rationally means aligning yourself with how reality actually works. The Stoics identified this cosmic reason with God, with Zeus, with fate, with nature, different names for the same thing. Everything that happens according to this rational order. Not because some external deity decides each event, but because the universe is itself intelligent and self-organizing. This leads to one of Stoicism's most controversial doctrines, determinism. Everything that happens had to happen exactly as it did, because it follows from the rational structure of the cosmos. You couldn't have chosen differently in any given moment, because your choice was part of that structure. How do you reconcile this with ethics, with the whole project of teaching people to live better? If everything's determined, why bother trying to improve? Zeno's answer: because your effort is part of the causal chain. You deliberate, you choose, you act. These aren't illusions. They're how the rational universe operates through you. The question isn't whether you have libertarian free will. The question is whether you act in accordance with reason or in opposition to it. Which brings us to ethics, the part of the system everything else supports. Zeno's fundamental claim: virtue is the only good. Not one good among others, the only good. Everything else that people typically value, health, wealth, reputation, pleasure, is neither good nor bad. It's indifferent. This sounds insane at first. Obviously, health is better than sickness. Obviously, wealth provides more options than poverty. Zeno wasn't denying these facts. He was making a distinction between value and goodness. Some indifferent things have value. They're naturally preferable. Health has value. So does enough wealth to meet your needs. So does living in a stable society rather than a war zone. These things aid your natural impulse towards self-preservation. Zeno called them preferred indifference, but they don't contribute to happiness. Happiness, eudaimonia, flourishing, whatever you want to call it, depends entirely on virtue, on the excellent use of reason. And virtue is completely within your control, regardless of external circumstances. A sick person can be virtuous. A poor person can be virtuous. Someone facing death can be virtuous. Because virtue is about how you respond to circumstances, not about which circumstances you find yourself in. This was the radical move. Zeno took the Socratic idea that virtue is knowledge and pushed it further than Socrates had. If virtue is knowledge, specifically knowledge of good and bad, then virtue is sufficient for happiness. You don't need anything else. The wise person is happy even on the rack, even in poverty, even facing execution. Most people found this absurd. Even some of Zeno's own students tried to moderate it. But Zeno was adamant. Either virtue is sufficient or it isn't. If it isn't, then your happiness depends partly on luck, on things outside your control. And if that's true, you can never be secure. Fortune can always take away whatever you depend on. But if virtue is sufficient, you're invulnerable. Not physically. You can still be hurt, killed, impoverished, but nothing can touch the core of who you are, your capacity to think and choose well. That's freedom. The flip side, vice is the only evil. Not pain, not poverty, not death. Vice. Acting against reason, choosing badly, failing to use your rational capacity properly. That's the only thing that actually harms you. This reconfigures everything. If someone insults you, have they harmed you? No. They've revealed their own vice, their failure to use reason well. Whether you're harmed depends entirely on how you respond. If you respond virtuously, with indifference to the insult while maintaining goodwill toward the person, you haven't been harmed at all. If someone steals your property, have they harmed you? They've committed injustice, yes. They've damaged themselves through vice, but they haven't damaged you unless you respond badly, unless you let the loss disturb your rational capacity to choose well. This isn't about pretending losses don't matter. It's about recognizing what actually makes your life go well or badly. External events are just external events. Your quality of life depends on your character, your virtue, your ability to maintain reason regardless of circumstances. Zeno wrote a book called Republic, modelling it on Plato's famous work, but reaching very different conclusions. It doesn't survive. We only have fragments and references from later sources, but those fragments reveal how radical his vision was. No temples, no law courts, no gymnasia, no coinage, no distinction between citizens and foreigners. Men and women completely equal. No marriage as a legal institution. People would form partnerships based on mutual consent and affection. No clothing norms. People would wear what served their needs. Everyone would live according to reason and natural law, making conventional institutions unnecessary. Critics attacked this work viciously. Even later Stoics were embarrassed by it. Some tried to suppress it, others to reinterpret it as metaphor. But it shows what Zeno actually believed, that most social conventions are arbitrary, that virtue doesn't require elaborate institutions, that the ideal society would be radically simple. This Cynic influence never entirely left Stoicism. The emphasis on self-sufficiency, on questioning conventions, on living according to nature rather than custom, these remained core even as later Stoics became more moderate, more willing to work within existing social structures. But there's a tension here that Zeno never fully resolved. If virtue is sufficient for happiness, if externals don't matter, why prefer some indifference over others? Why call health preferable if it doesn't contribute to happiness? Zeno's answer involved the concept of appropriate action, kathekon in Greek. These are actions that accord with nature, that have a reasonable justification. It's appropriate to care for your health, to seek adequate wealth, to protect your family. Not because these things are good, but because they align with your natural constitution as a rational animal. The wise person performs appropriate actions, but without attachment. They'll take the medicine, but won't be disturbed if it doesn't work. They'll seek employment, but won't despair if they can't find it. The action is appropriate. The outcome is indifferent. This is sophisticated, but it creates problems. If you act to achieve health, aren't you treating health as a goal? If it's genuinely indifferent, why are you pursuing it? The later Stoics would spend centuries trying to articulate this relationship between virtue, appropriate action, and preferred indifference. Zeno taught all this walking up and down the Stoa, clarifying through dialogue, adjusting arguments in response to objections. His personal presence mattered. People came to hear him not just for the arguments, but for the example he set. Here was someone living according to his principles, visibly at peace despite his austerity, self-controlled without apparent effort. Ancient sources say he was gloomy, earnest, preferring small gatherings to crowds. He disliked elaborate speeches and verbose explanations. His teaching style was spare, focused, intense. When he spoke, people listened, not because he was charismatic in the conventional sense, but because his conviction was absolute, and his life backed up his words. Students gathered. Some would become famous philosophers themselves. Perseus, who might have started as Zeno's slave, but became his pupil and eventually advised kings. Aristo of Chios, who pushed Zeno's ethics even further toward pure cynicism before breaking away to start his own school. Sphaerus, who specialized in logic and definition. And Cleanthes, the water carrier, who worked manual labor to support himself while studying philosophy, and who would eventually inherit leadership of the school. Cleanthes was crucial. He wasn't brilliant. Ancient sources say he was slow, methodical, more devoted than naturally gifted. But he absorbed Zeno's teaching completely and preserved it through his own long tenure as school head. Without Cleanthes, early Stoicism might have fragmented immediately after Zeno's death. With him, it had time to consolidate, to become a tradition rather than just one man's ideas. But that's getting ahead of the story. For now, we're still in the early years, probably around 300 BC. Zeno in his 30s, teaching in the Stoa, building the philosophical system that will define his legacy. The word Stoic doesn't mean much yet. It's just the name for people who listen to this particular teacher in this particular colonnade. The ideas are spreading though. People argue about them in the agora, in private homes, at dinner parties. Is virtue really sufficient? Can you really be happy while being tortured? What about this republic where everything's abolished? Some think Zeno's brilliant. Others think he's insane. Most are somewhere in between, intrigued but skeptical. And then something unexpected happens. Someone powerful starts paying attention. Someone who will give Stoicism credibility it couldn't have gained through philosophical argument alone. Antigonus Gonatas was the king of Macedonia, one of the successor kingdoms carved from Alexander's empire. He wasn't just powerful, he was philosophical. He'd studied under Menedemus of Eretria, read widely, corresponded with intellectuals. When he visited Athens, which he did regularly since Athens was technically under Macedonian influence, he sought out philosophers the way other kings sought out prostitutes or wine. And he heard about Zeno. The sources don't tell us exactly when they first met, probably sometime in the 280s BC. What we know is that Antigonus became fascinated. Here was a teacher whose personal conduct matched his doctrine, who lived simply despite growing fame, who refused payment for teaching, who was transforming young Athenians into models of self-control. Antigonus attended lectures when he could. He invited Zeno to dine. He wanted to bring this philosopher into his court, to have access to his wisdom, to be educated by him. Zeno refused. This is remarkable. Kings didn't get refused often. Refusing a king's invitation was dangerous, potentially fatal, but Antigonus wasn't that kind of ruler, and Zeno knew it. He declined politely but firmly. He wouldn't leave Athens. He wouldn't abandon his school. He wouldn't become a court philosopher, dependent on royal favour, compromised by proximity to power. Instead, Zeno sent Perseus. Perseus was one of his students, possibly a former slave who'd been freed and educated in philosophy. The sources conflict on his exact status, but what's clear is that he lived in Zeno's household and absorbed his teaching thoroughly. Antigonus accepted this arrangement. If he couldn't have the master, he'd take the disciple. Perseus went to Macedonia and became part of the king's circle, advising him on matters philosophical and practical. This relationship between Zeno and Antigonus tells us something important about Stoicism's social position. It wasn't marginal, it wasn't the philosophy of outcasts and weirdos. The king of Macedonia took it seriously. That meant everyone else had to as well. But Zeno maintained his independence. He lived in Athens, in a modest house, eating his figs and basking in the sun, teaching whoever came to listen. The school grew. More students arrived. Some became philosophers themselves. Others absorbed the teaching and returned to ordinary life, carrying Stoic principles into business, politics, military service. The most important student was Cleanthes of Assos. He arrived in Athens poor, having fled from the army, or maybe just seeking something better than manual labour in his hometown. The sources say he worked as a water carrier, hauling water at night, so he could attend Zeno's lectures during the day. This is probably romanticised, most origin stories are, but it captures something true about Cleanthes. He was persistent, methodical, not naturally brilliant, but absolutely devoted. Zeno recognised this devotion. Cleanthes wasn't the fastest student. He didn't produce clever arguments or dazzling interpretations. He absorbed slowly, thoroughly, like soil soaking up water. Other students mocked him. They called him the donkey because he was slow and carried heavy loads. Zeno defended him. "The donkey alone can carry my burdens," he said. This turned out to be prophetic. When Zeno died decades later, Cleanthes would inherit the school. And because he was methodical and conservative, because he preserved rather than innovated, Stoicism survived its founder. The teaching didn't fragment into competing interpretations. It remained coherent long enough to take root. But that's still far in the future. In the early years, say the 290s BC, the school is just beginning to establish itself. Zeno is in his 40s, mature, confident. His ideas developed enough to present systematically. He's writing too. The Republic comes first, probably. Then works on ethics, on physics, on logic. None of these survive except as fragments quoted by later authors, but we know they existed, and we know they were influential. The Republic is particularly important because it shows how radical early Stoicism was. Plato had written his Republic as a thought experiment about the ideal city, governed by philosopher kings, with strict class divisions and elaborate educational systems. Zeno wrote his as a response, maybe a critique, maybe just an alternative vision. Zeno's Republic abolishes almost everything. No temples, the wise don't need religious institutions. No law courts, the wise don't commit crimes. No gymnasia, physical training is irrelevant to virtue. No coinage, monetary systems create inequality and corruption. No elaborate education, the only education that matters is learning to live according to nature. Men and women are completely equal. There's no gender hierarchy because virtue doesn't depend on sex. Everyone wears the same simple clothing. Sexual relationships are free. No marriage laws, no restrictions based on custom. The only bond that matters is shared rationality, shared virtue. It's cynicism with a philosophical foundation. Diogenes had rejected convention through provocative actions. Zeno rejected it through systematic argument. The conclusion was similar. Most of what society considers necessary is actually harmful. Strip it away. Live according to reason. Everything else is noise. This republic scandalized people. Even later Stoics were embarrassed by it. Cicero mentions that some tried to suppress it or claim it wasn't authentic. By the Roman period, Stoicism had become respectable, conservative, the philosophy of senators and emperors. Zeno's radical vision didn't fit that image, but in the early days, it was part of the appeal. Philosophy wasn't just abstract reasoning, it was a comprehensive alternative to conventional life. You could study with Zeno and learn not just how to think but how to live, how to organize society, how to imagine a world structured by reason rather than tradition. Not everyone bought it. Aristo of Chios, one of Zeno's students, pushed the ethics even further. If only virtue matters, if everything else is genuinely indifferent, then we shouldn't even bother distinguishing between preferred and dispreferred indifference. Health and sickness, wealth and poverty, life and death, all equally irrelevant. The wise person is completely detached, performing actions mechanically without caring about results. Zeno rejected this. It was too extreme, too divorced from actual human life. Yes, only virtue matters ultimately, but we still live in bodies that need food, in societies that require participation. Appropriate actions matter even if their outcomes don't. This tension between radical principle and practical application would become a permanent feature of Stoicism, never fully resolved. Another student, Spherus, specialized in logic and definition. He tried to make Stoic concepts more precise, to defend them against philosophical attacks. This was necessary because Stoicism immediately attracted critics. The academics, followers of Plato who'd become skeptics, attacked Stoic epistemology. The Epicureans attacked Stoic physics and theology. Other schools mocked the paradoxes. The wise person is happy on the rack. 1 minute separates the sage from the fool. These debates mattered. Philosophy in Athens wasn't academic in the modern sense. It was competitive, public, sometimes vicious. Schools fought for students, for prestige, for intellectual dominance. Zeno had to defend his ideas constantly, refine arguments, respond to objections. This sharpened Stoicism, forced it to become more sophisticated. The physical theory, for instance, developed partly in response to challenges. Zeno taught that the universe is a living, rational organism. God isn't separate from the cosmos. God is the cosmos, or more precisely, God is the rational principle that structures and animates matter. Everything is material, even souls, even God. But not all matter is the same. Some is inert, passive. Some is active, intelligent, creative. This active principle is pneuma, literally breath or spirit, a kind of tensed fire that pervades everything and holds it together. This sounds strange to us, mixing what we'd separate into matter and mind, physics and theology, but it made sense in the context of ancient debates about substance and causation, and it had practical implications. If the universe is rational, if everything happens according to divine reason, then fate is real. Everything is predetermined, not by arbitrary gods, but by the logical structure of reality itself. This creates an obvious problem. If everything is fated, how can we be responsible for our actions? If I'm going to do what I'm going to do regardless of my choices, why bother trying to be virtuous? Zeno's answer involved distinguishing between kinds of causes. Yes, the ultimate outcome is fated, but your response to circumstances is up to you. The external event is predetermined. You'll be offered a bribe, you'll face a threat, you'll lose your property. But whether you accept the bribe, yield to the threat, or despair over the loss, that's your choice. Fate determines what happens to you. You determine how you respond. This isn't completely satisfying. The distinction between external circumstances and internal responses starts to break down under pressure. If your character is also part of fate, if your decision to act virtuously is itself predetermined, then in what sense are you choosing? The Stoics would argue about this for centuries, never reaching a resolution that silenced all objections. But Zeno wasn't trying to create a perfect system immune to criticism. He was trying to articulate a way of living that acknowledged fate without producing passivity, that maintained human responsibility within a deterministic framework. You can't control events, you can control your judgments about events. That's the space where virtue operates. His teaching combined formal lectures with conversation. Students asked questions, raised objections, proposed scenarios. Zeno responded, adjusted, clarified. The Stoa poikile became a kind of laboratory for philosophical ideas, tested through dialogue, refined through debate. This made Stoicism unusually resilient. It wasn't one man's vision imposed on passive followers. It was a collaborative project built through argument. By the 200s BC, Stoicism was established. Not dominant, Athens had multiple philosophical schools competing for attention, but recognized as a serious option. Young men from wealthy families studied with Zeno. So did slaves seeking education. So did foreigners passing through Athens. The school was growing, the ideas spreading beyond the immediate circle of students. And Zeno was aging. He was probably in his 50s by this point, still vigorous but no longer young. His frugal lifestyle was catching up with him. The thin clothing, the uncooked food, the constant outdoor teaching, these took their toll. Ancient sources describe him as increasingly gaunt. His dark skin stretched over sharp bones, his movements slower, more deliberate, but his mind remained clear. If anything, his teaching became more focused, distilled to essentials. He'd spent decades developing his system. Now he was passing it on, ensuring it would survive him. Cleanthes was there, absorbing everything, preparing without knowing it to become the next school head. Other students were spreading Stoic ideas through their own teaching and writing. The philosophy was taking root beyond its founder. Zeno kept teaching, day after day, year after year, walking up and down the Stoa, clarifying concepts, answering questions, embodying the principles he taught. People came to see him as much as to hear him. Here was someone who'd achieved what philosophy promised: tranquility, self-sufficiency, virtue. He wasn't pretending, he wasn't performing, he simply was what he taught. This authenticity mattered more than any argument. You can prove that virtue is sufficient for happiness, but proving it and demonstrating it are different things. Zeno demonstrated it. His life was the argument. Antigonus kept trying to bring him to court. The invitations continued, more elaborate, more generous. Zeno kept declining. He sent letters instead, maintaining the relationship but preserving his independence. The king understood. He respected Zeno more for the refusal than he would have for acceptance. Here was someone who couldn't be bought, couldn't be flattered, couldn't be moved from his principles by royal favour. The Athenians noticed too. This foreign philosopher, this Phoenician or Greek or whatever he was, had become a fixture of their city, a moral authority people turned to. He wasn't Athenian by birth, but he'd become Athenian by adoption, more committed to the city's intellectual life than many natives. And something was building. Recognition, honour, official acknowledgement of what Zeno had achieved. The city was preparing to do something unprecedented, something that would cement his legacy and prove that philosophy could matter in the real world, that virtue could be recognised even by political institutions normally indifferent to it. Around 261 BC, the assembly met. Not for routine business, but for something extraordinary. They were voting on an honour no foreign philosopher had ever received. The proposal came from multiple citizens, but the driving force was clear. Athens wanted to recognise what Zeno had accomplished. The decree was read aloud. The language was formal, official, but the emotion behind it unmistakable. Whereas Zeno of Citium, son of Monoceus, has for many years been devoted to philosophy in the city, and has continued to be a man of worth in all other respects, exhorting to virtue and temperance those of the youth who come to him to be taught, directing them to what is best, affording to all in his own conduct a pattern for imitation in perfect consistency with his teaching. The assembly voted. The decree passed. Zeno was awarded a golden crown, the city's highest honour. A tomb would be built at public expense when he died, and they offered him citizenship, full membership in the Athenian Demos, the most exclusive club in the Greek world. Think about what this meant. Athens didn't hand out citizenship casually. You were born into it or you didn't get it. The city had spent centuries protecting the privilege, limiting it, keeping outsiders at arm's length. Now they were offering it to a Phoenician merchant's son who'd washed up on their shores 40 years earlier with nothing but questions. Zeno declined. Not the honours, he accepted the crown and the recognition. But the citizenship itself, he refused. Why? The sources say he didn't want to appear unfaithful to Citium, his birthplace. He'd lived in Athens most of his adult life. He'd built his school there, shaped its intellectual culture, become part of the city's identity. But he wouldn't abandon his origins, wouldn't pretend he was something he wasn't. This wasn't false modesty, it was consistency. His entire philosophy centered on living according to nature, accepting what is, not pretending otherwise. He was from Citium. That fact couldn't be changed by a vote. So he thanked Athens, accepted their honours, and remained what he'd always been, a foreigner who'd earned their respect through virtue, not birth. The Athenians understood. They compared him to Cadmus, the legendary Phoenician prince who'd brought the alphabet to Greece. Just as Cadmus had given them writing, Zeno had given them Stoicism. The comparison was deliberate. Both were outsiders who'd enriched Greek culture with gifts that became fundamental. A bronze statue was erected. Inscriptions praised him as the noblest man of his age. The phrase, more self-controlled than Zeno, entered common usage as the ultimate compliment. You didn't just say someone was disciplined, you said they were like Zeno. But here's what's remarkable about all this recognition. It didn't change him. Some people transform when honoured. They start believing their own press, becoming caricatures of what made them notable in the first place. Zeno kept teaching. Same place, same manner, same worn cloak and uncooked meals. The golden crown probably ended up in storage somewhere. He had no use for it. The tomb that would be built after his death, he wouldn't see it. The bronze statue, just metal shaped to look like him. These things meant something to Athens. To Zeno, they were preferred indifference. Nice to have, perhaps, but irrelevant to virtue, which was the only thing that mattered. And he was getting old. The sources aren't precise about his age, but he was probably in his early 70s by now. That was ancient by Greek standards. Most men didn't make it past 50. Zeno had outlived most of his generation through sheer stubbornness and ascetic discipline. But time catches everyone. His movements were slower. The daily walks in the Stoa required more effort. Students noticed him, pausing more often, catching his breath, his gaunt frame seeming to fold in on itself. Yet his mind stayed sharp. The teaching continued. If anything, it intensified. He knew what was coming. Everyone does eventually. And in a philosophy that emphasized acceptance of fate, of the natural order, death wasn't something to fear or fight. It was just the next thing that would happen. Cleanthes was ready to take over. The succession was clear. Zeno had trained him for years, watched him develop from a day labourer carrying water to a philosopher capable of leading the school. The institution would survive its founder. That's what institutions are supposed to do, but there's a difference between intellectual preparation for death and the physical reality of it. Zeno could explain rationally why fearing death was irrational. He could demonstrate through Stoic physics how individual souls return to the cosmic fire, how nothing is truly lost. He could cite Socrates' calm acceptance of the hemlock. Understanding death philosophically doesn't make it less final. The body knows what's coming even when the mind has made peace with it. Around 262 BC, everything accelerated. The details are sparse, but the outline is clear. Zeno was leaving the school one day. Just a normal day. Teaching finished, students dispersed. He was walking, as he'd walked thousands of times before, and he tripped. That's it. He tripped and fell, breaking his toe, a minor injury. Painful, certainly, but not life-threatening. People break toes and heal. Except Zeno looked at his broken toe and made a decision. The ancient sources preserve what he said, though whether he actually said it, or whether this is later embellishment, we can't know. He supposedly quoted a line from Niobe, a lost play by either Aeschylus or Sophocles. "I come, why do you call me?" Then he held his breath until he died. Some versions say he strangled himself. Others say he simply stopped breathing through force of will. The details vary, but the core remains consistent. Zeno chose to die rather than continue living with a broken toe. This sounds insane to modern ears. Suicidal. A massive overreaction to a trivial injury. But remember who we're talking about. This was a man who'd spent 50 years teaching that the wise person lives according to nature, that virtue consists in accepting what is appropriate at each moment, that you should act when action is called for, and stop when stopping is called for. Zeno was 72 years old, gaunt from decades of ascetic living, his body worn down by years of outdoor teaching in thin clothing. A broken toe at that age, in an era with no antibiotics and minimal medical care, could easily become infected. The recovery would be long, painful, potentially crippling. He'd be unable to teach, unable to walk the Stoa, unable to embody the principles he'd spent his life demonstrating. More fundamentally, he'd lived a complete life. He'd established his school, trained his successor, earned recognition from Athens, influenced a generation of students. His philosophical system was fully developed, his major works written. What more was there to accomplish? The Stoic sage was supposed to recognize what was appropriate in each situation. Sometimes it's appropriate to fight, to persist, to endure. Sometimes it's appropriate to stop. Zeno looked at his broken toe and recognized it as a signal. Nature was calling him. The appropriate response was to answer, so he did. This wasn't depression or impulsivity. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent practicing what he preached. He taught that externals don't matter, that only virtue matters, that the wise person maintains perfect consistency between belief and action. Now at the end, he demonstrated that teaching one final time. The Stoics of later generations debated this death. Some praised it as the perfect example of philosophical consistency. Others worried it set a dangerous precedent. If breaking a toe justifies suicide, what doesn't? But Zeno wasn't establishing a general principle. He was making a particular choice in a particular situation. That's what Stoic ethics demanded. Not rigid rules applied mechanically, but wisdom recognizing what each moment required. Athens buried him with full honours. The public funeral the decree had promised, the tomb built at city expense, the eulogies praising his virtue and his influence. The school he'd founded continued under Cleanthes, who proved a capable, if less charismatic, leader. Stoicism was established. It would outlive not just Zeno, but Athens itself, spreading across the Mediterranean world, influencing Roman emperors and slaves, becoming one of the ancient world's most successful philosophical movements. All of that happened later. At the moment of his death, Zeno was just a 72-year-old man with a broken toe who decided it was time to go. The simplicity of it is striking. No final grand statement, no deathbed wisdom passed to gathered students. Just a quote from a play and a choice to stop breathing. Everything he needed to say, he'd already said. His life was the argument. The manner of his death was merely its conclusion, appropriate and inevitable. What do we make of this? A man born in Cyprus, educated by cynics, teaching in Athens, honoured by the city but declining citizenship, dying by his own hand after a minor accident. It's a strange story, foreign to how we think about achievement and legacy. We want our philosophers to die peacefully in bed, preferably old, and surrounded by devoted students recording their final words. Zeno tripped and broke his toe and decided that was enough. The strangeness is part of the point. Stoicism wasn't about conforming to expectations or following conventional wisdom. It was about seeing clearly what's truly important and acting accordingly, regardless of what others think. Zeno did that until his last breath, literally. The golden crown Athens gave him is long gone. The bronze statue was probably melted down centuries ago. The tomb crumbled to dust, but Stoicism survived. The ideas he developed, walking up and down that painted colonnade, arguing with students, refining concepts, those ideas spread and evolved and influenced millions. Marcus Aurelius, sitting in a military camp on the Danube frontier 800 years later, writing his private meditations, was engaging with Zeno's philosophy. Epictetus, teaching slaves how to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances, was extending Zeno's insights. Seneca, advising emperors and writing letters about how to live well, was building on Zeno's foundation. And in a different way, all those ordinary people across the Roman Empire who encountered Stoic ideas and found in them tools for navigating life, they were Zeno's heirs too. The philosophy worked because it addressed something fundamental. How do you maintain integrity in a world that doesn't care about your values? How do you find peace when circumstances are beyond your control? How do you live well when the only thing you truly control is your own judgment and response? Zeno's answer: focus on what's within your power. Develop virtue. Accept what you cannot change. Respond appropriately to each situation. Live according to nature. Simple principles, difficult to apply, but genuinely useful. That's why they lasted. But there's a tension at the heart of Zeno's legacy that's worth examining. His chosen death by his own hand doesn't fit comfortably with how later Stoics would approach the question of suicide. The question of suicide divides them sharply. Marcus Aurelius, writing centuries later, would counsel endurance, acceptance, continuing to fulfill one's role until nature itself determines the end. He wouldn't have approved of Zeno's choice. Neither would many modern readers. We're trained to see suicide as inherently tragic, a failure of some kind, even when we intellectually accept arguments for personal autonomy in end-of-life decisions. The discomfort is instructive, though. It forces us to ask what we actually believe about agency and appropriateness. Zeno thought his response to a broken toe was perfectly rational. He'd lived a full life, accomplished what he set out to accomplish, and a minor injury at 72 suggested his body was beginning to fail. Why wait for worse? His death was consistent with his teaching in ways we might not initially recognize. He'd spent decades arguing that the only true good is virtue, that external circumstances, health, wealth, reputation, are indifferent. They have no bearing on whether you're living well or badly. What matters is your response to circumstances, not the circumstances themselves. From that perspective, choosing when to die isn't fundamentally different from choosing what to eat for breakfast. It's a judgment call about what's appropriate given the situation. You're not choosing between good and evil. You're selecting among indifferent options based on rational assessments. This sounds cold until you remember that Zeno also taught that living according to nature means recognizing yourself as part of a larger whole. You have duties to others, to your community, to the cosmic order. The sage doesn't act selfishly or impulsively. He considers what's appropriate in context. So the question becomes, was Zeno's suicide appropriate? Did it fulfill his duties or abandon them? The Athenians apparently thought it appropriate enough. They gave him a public funeral, erected monuments, passed decrees honoring his memory. No scandal attached to how he died. The ancient world generally took a more pragmatic view of suicide than modern Christianity would later permit. It wasn't automatically condemned. It could be rational, even admirable, depending on circumstances. But there's something else happening in this story that's worth pausing over. Zeno's death wasn't just a philosophical position enacted. It was also, maybe primarily, the death of an old man who'd reached his limit. The philosophy provided justification and framework, but the human reality was simpler. He was tired, he was done. The broken toe was just the moment when he decided to acknowledge what was already true. This is where philosophy meets life, and the gap between them becomes visible. The theoretical position that external circumstances are indifferent sounds compelling in a lecture. Living it out when your body hurts and you're 72 and you trip over your own feet. That's different. Zeno's response might have been philosophically consistent, but it was also humanly understandable in ways that have nothing to do with Stoic theory. We do him a disservice if we read his death only through the lens of his philosophy. He was a person, not just a position. The ideas mattered to him deeply. He'd devoted his entire adult life to developing and teaching them. But he also had knees that probably ached, and a digestion that probably troubled him, and 1,000 minor discomforts that don't make it into the historical record. Philosophy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's embodied, lived by actual people dealing with actual circumstances. The influence question is interesting precisely because it separates the ideas from the man. Stoicism, as it developed over the next 5 centuries, wasn't exactly what Zeno taught. His successors modified, expanded, refined. Chrysippus, who led the school 2 generations later, was considered the true systematizer of Stoic logic. By the time Stoicism reached Rome, it had absorbed influences Zeno never encountered. The Roman Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, were responding to their own contexts, their own challenges, their own political realities. Yet they all claimed Zeno as founder. They traced their intellectual lineage back to that colonnade in Athens, where a Cypriot merchant with a broken nose and an austere lifestyle taught students about virtue and living according to nature. The core insights remained recognizable even as the details shifted. That's what made Stoicism successful. It was flexible enough to adapt while maintaining a coherent center. Compare this to Epicureanism, which was more rigid, more dependent on the founder's exact teachings. When circumstances changed, Epicureans had less room to maneuver. Stoicism could evolve because Zeno had built something sturdy but not brittle. The basic framework, focus on what you control, develop virtue, accept what you cannot change, was simple enough to travel across cultures and centuries while being rich enough to generate ongoing philosophical work. The Roman adoption of Stoicism is particularly striking. Rome was an empire, violent and expansionist, built on conquest and slavery. Stoicism, with its emphasis on universal human brotherhood and the equality of all rational beings, should have been fundamentally at odds with Roman social structure. Yet Roman elites embraced it enthusiastically. How does that work? Partially through selective reading. You can interpret living according to nature in ways that justify existing hierarchies. If nature has ordained that some people rule and others serve, then accepting your station is virtuous. The more radical implications of Stoic equality could be downplayed or ignored. This happened. Roman Stoics weren't revolutionary. They worked within the system, trying to be better individuals rather than transforming society. But that's not the whole story. Stoicism also genuinely helped people navigate impossible situations. If you're a slave, and Epictetus was born into slavery, the Stoic distinction between what's in your power and what isn't becomes intensely practical. You can't change your legal status. You can change how you respond to it. You can maintain dignity, develop virtue, refuse to let circumstances determine your worth. That's not just philosophical consolation, it's a survival tool. The same applies to emperors, though from the opposite direction. Marcus Aurelius inherited absolute power he didn't ask for. He couldn't abdicate without triggering civil war. He had to rule. Stoicism gave him a framework for doing so without being corrupted by power. Not perfectly. He made mistakes, persecuted Christians, fought wars, but better than he might have otherwise. This adaptability is what made Stoicism one of the few ancient philosophies to survive the collapse of the classical world. When Christianity became dominant, most pagan philosophies were suppressed or forgotten. Stoicism persisted because its core insights were compatible with Christian theology. Church fathers like Augustine absorbed Stoic elements. Medieval philosophers studied Stoic texts. The tradition continued, underground but unbroken. Then in the Renaissance, when classical learning revived, Stoicism came roaring back. Humanist scholars rediscovered Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. The ideas felt fresh and relevant to a world undergoing massive upheaval. If you're living through the Reformation and religious wars, Stoic advice about focusing on what you control and accepting what you cannot has obvious appeal. This brings us to a question that's been lurking throughout. Is Stoicism actually true? Do its core claims about virtue, rationality, and human nature hold up? Or is it just psychologically useful regardless of truth? The physics obviously doesn't work. The Stoics believed in a material universe pervaded by divine reason, with everything predetermined by fate, yet somehow allowing for human responsibility. The metaphysics is incoherent by modern standards. We don't believe in cosmic logos or that the universe is a living, rational being. The Stoic worldview as a complete system is dead. But the ethics, that's more complicated. The claim that virtue is the only true good, that external circumstances are indifferent, that's a philosophical position you can argue for or against, but it's not obviously wrong. It makes a kind of sense. If happiness depends on things outside your control, wealth, health, reputation, then you're vulnerable. One accident, one piece of bad luck, and you're miserable. But if happiness depends only on your own virtue, your own character and choices, then you're secure. Nothing can take that away. The counter-argument is equally strong. External circumstances obviously matter. Poverty makes life harder. Illness causes real suffering. To call these things indifferent seems inhuman, disconnected from lived experience. The Stoic sage who remains serene while being tortured sounds less like an ideal and more like someone who's shut down emotionally. Maybe the truth is somewhere between. External circumstances matter, but not as much as we typically think. Character and attitude matter more than we typically acknowledge. The Stoic emphasis on what's within your control isn't wrong, even if the extreme version, virtue is sufficient for happiness, goes too far. What definitely survives is the practical advice. Focus on what you can change, accept what you cannot. Respond appropriately to each situation. Don't waste energy on things outside your power. These aren't metaphysical claims. They're strategies for living that work regardless of whether the underlying philosophy is true. This might be Zeno's real legacy, not a complete philosophical system, but a set of tools that remain useful even after the theory supporting them has crumbled. You don't need to believe in cosmic logos to benefit from distinguishing between what you control and what you don't. You don't need Stoic physics to find value in the idea that your response to circumstances matters more than the circumstances themselves. The modern Stoicism revival, visible in self-help books and productivity blogs, tends to strip away the metaphysics and keep the practical advice. That would probably horrify Zeno. For him, the physics and ethics were inseparable. You couldn't understand how to live without understanding the nature of the cosmos. The practical advice derived from theoretical commitments. But maybe that separation is inevitable. Philosophies that survive do so by adapting. They get simplified, reinterpreted, mixed with other traditions. What we call Stoicism today isn't what Zeno taught. It's a descendant, changed by 2,000 years of transmission and transformation. That's not necessarily bad. It's how ideas live. Zeno himself did this. He took elements from Cynicism, from Socratic philosophy, from the Megarian school, from Plato's academy. He synthesized them into something new. His students modified what he taught. Their students modified it further. The tradition was always evolving. The question isn't whether modern Stoicism is authentic to Zeno. It isn't. The question is whether the ideas remain valuable. Do they help people live better lives? If yes, then the tradition continues successfully, even if the details have changed. If no, then Stoicism becomes a historical curiosity, something we study to understand the ancient world, but don't apply to our own lives. The evidence suggests the ideas do remain valuable, at least to some people. The books sell, the online communities grow. People report finding genuine help in Stoic practices like negative visualization or the dichotomy of control. Not everyone, not universally, but enough to suggest there's something there. What's striking is which parts get emphasized. Modern Stoicism focuses heavily on control, on not worrying about externals, on maintaining equanimity. These are real Stoic themes, but they're not the only ones. The social dimension, our duties to others, the cosmopolitan vision of universal human community, gets less attention. The metaphysics disappears almost entirely. What remains is individualistic, psychological, focused on personal resilience and emotional regulation. This reflects our current cultural moment. We're anxious, overwhelmed, drowning in information and expectations. We want tools for managing stress, for maintaining sanity in chaotic circumstances. Stoicism provides that, but it provided other things too, and the selective adoption changes what the philosophy means. Zeno wouldn't recognize this version of Stoicism. He'd probably be appalled by its therapeutic focus, its disconnection from cosmic understanding, its reduction to life hacks. But he's been dead for over 2,000 years. His opinion doesn't determine whether the current use of his ideas is legitimate. What matters is whether people engaging with Stoicism today are getting something real from it. If the ideas help them live better, more intentionally, more virtuously, more peacefully, then the tradition serves its purpose. If it becomes just another form of self-optimization, another way to maximize productivity while ignoring structural problems, then maybe it's been corrupted into something that betrays its origins. The tension between individual and society, between accepting circumstances and working to change them, has always been present in Stoicism. Zeno's Republic was radical, imagining a world without conventional institutions, where everyone lived according to reason. But his actual teaching emphasized virtue within existing structures. Later Stoics sometimes counseled political engagement, sometimes withdrawal. The philosophy contains both impulses. This ambiguity is productive. It means Stoicism can speak to different situations, different needs. Someone dealing with circumstances they truly cannot change finds resources for acceptance and dignity. Someone with power to make changes finds guidance for acting virtuously. The framework is flexible enough to address both, but it's also frustrating. What should you actually do? When is acceptance appropriate? And when is it complacency? How do you know whether you're being wise or just passive? Stoicism doesn't answer these questions with algorithmic precision. It offers principles, not prescriptions. And you have to figure out the application yourself. Maybe that's the point. Philosophy isn't supposed to remove the need for judgment. It's supposed to train your judgment, give you better tools for thinking through difficult situations. Zeno taught people how to think, not what to think. The rest was up to them. The problem with expecting philosophy to provide formulas is that it fundamentally misunderstands what philosophy is supposed to do. Zeno didn't develop Stoicism as a decision-making algorithm. He developed it as a way of understanding the world and your place in it. The decisions follow from that understanding, but they're not automatic. They require you to actually think. This is where modern applications sometimes go wrong. They extract techniques, the dichotomy of control, negative visualization, the view from above, and treat them as standalone tools. Use this mental exercise when you're stressed. Apply this framework when making decisions. It's self-help disguised as ancient wisdom, which isn't necessarily bad. If reframing your problems in terms of what you can and can't control actually helps you manage anxiety, that's valuable. The question is whether it's still Stoicism or something else that's borrowed Stoic vocabulary. Zeno would probably say it depends on why you're using the technique. Are you trying to cultivate virtue, to align your will with the rational order of the universe, to become a better person in a comprehensive sense, or are you just trying to feel less stressed so you can be more productive? The former is Stoic, the latter is just optimization. But here's the complication. Zeno himself used practical examples. He talked about how to handle insults, how to deal with difficult people, how to respond when things go wrong. The philosophy wasn't purely abstract. It was meant to be applied to actual situations. The difference is context. Those practical applications were embedded in a larger framework that included metaphysics, logic, and a comprehensive vision of human nature and cosmic order. Remove that framework and you're left with techniques that might work but don't necessarily mean what they originally meant. Take the famous Stoic practice of contemplating your own death. Modern versions present this as a gratitude exercise. Remind yourself you could die tomorrow, so appreciate what you have today. That's not wrong exactly, but it's not quite what the Stoics were doing either. For Zeno and his followers, death wasn't just a motivational tool, it was a fundamental part of understanding human existence. We're mortal beings, living in a cosmos governed by fate. Death is natural, inevitable, and not an evil. Understanding this deeply changes how you live, not just by making you more grateful, but by shifting your entire relationship to existence. The modern version is shallower. It uses the thought of death instrumentally, as a way to generate positive feelings. The ancient version integrated death into a complete worldview. Same practice, different meaning. This pattern repeats throughout modern Stoicism. The vocabulary is ancient, but the purposes are contemporary. We want resilience in the face of uncertainty, emotional regulation in a chaotic world, meaning in lives that feel increasingly fragmented. Stoicism offers resources for all of that, but it offered those things as part of a package that included claims about the nature of reality that most modern practitioners don't actually believe. Does that matter? Only if you think philosophical coherence matters. If you're purely pragmatic, if you only care whether something works, not whether it makes sense as a unified system, then extracting useful pieces is fine. Take what helps and leave the rest. But Zeno would argue that you can't separate technique from understanding. The practices work because they're grounded in true beliefs about the world. If you don't share those beliefs, you're just going through motions that might produce temporary benefits, but won't lead to genuine wisdom. There's also the question of who gets to say what Stoicism is. Zeno founded the school, but he didn't own it. His students developed his ideas in different directions. Cleanthes emphasized different aspects than Chrysippus. Later Stoics like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius adapted the philosophy to Roman circumstances that Zeno never imagined. Traditions change. That's how they survive. The alternative is fossilization, becoming a historical curiosity that nobody actually uses. If Stoicism had remained exactly as Zeno taught it, bound to the metaphysical assumptions of Hellenistic Greece, it would have died out centuries ago. Instead, it adapted. Roman Stoics made it more practical, less concerned with physics and logic, more focused on ethics and self-improvement. Medieval Christians incorporated Stoic ideas into their theology. Enlightenment thinkers found resources in Stoic natural law theory. Each generation took what it needed and left what it didn't. Modern Stoicism is just the latest adaptation. It emphasizes psychology over metaphysics, individual flourishing over cosmic citizenship, practical techniques over systematic philosophy. This reflects what contemporary people need and want. Whether it's authentic Stoicism depends on how strictly you define authenticity. One way to think about it is the current version continuous with the original in some meaningful way? Does it maintain core principles even while changing surface features? The case for yes points to continuity in values. Virtue is the only true good, the importance of rational self-control, the distinction between what's up to us and what isn't, the idea that we should live according to nature. These themes run through ancient and modern Stoicism. The case for no points to discontinuity in worldview. Modern Stoics don't believe in a rational cosmos ordered by logos. They don't think fate governs everything. They don't see humans as fragments of divine reason. Without that metaphysical foundation, what remains is psychology wearing Stoic clothes. Both perspectives have merit. Traditions do maintain identity across change, but there are limits. At some point, the changes are so substantial that calling something by the old name becomes misleading. Where is that point? Nobody knows. It's not like there's an official board that certifies authentic Stoicism. The tradition exists in how people use it, and people use it in various ways, some closer to the original, some more adapted, all claiming the label. What we can say is that Zeno created something flexible enough to survive 2 millennia of transformation. The core insights about control, virtue, rationality, nature proved durable enough to be repeatedly reinterpreted for new contexts. That's a remarkable achievement. Whether what we have now is still Stoicism or something new that borrowed from Stoicism is partly a semantic question. The more interesting question is whether it works. Does it help people live better? Does it provide genuine wisdom or just temporary relief? The evidence is mixed. Some people find lasting benefit. They report becoming more resilient, less reactive, better at distinguishing what matters from what doesn't. They develop a more philosophical attitude toward life's difficulties. For them, modern Stoicism delivers something real. Others find it unsatisfying. The techniques feel superficial. The philosophy seems to encourage passivity in the face of injustice. The emphasis on individual psychology ignores structural problems that require collective action. For them, Stoicism is at best incomplete, at worst actively harmful. Both groups are probably right about their own experience. Philosophy isn't one size fits all. What helps one person might not help another. What's profound for someone at one stage of life might seem obvious or wrong-headed later. This variability suggests we should be careful about making universal claims. Stoicism isn't the answer to everything. It's one philosophical tradition among many, with particular strengths and particular limitations. Recognizing those boundaries is itself a form of wisdom. The limitations become especially clear when we think about social and political dimensions. Modern Stoicism's focus on individual psychology can make it seem like all problems are internal. You're stressed about money? Change your attitude toward wealth. You're angry about injustice? Work on your emotional reactions. You're frustrated by circumstances? Accept what you can't control. This advice isn't wrong exactly. Your internal state does matter. How you respond to circumstances is within your power in ways that the circumstances themselves often aren't. But taken too far, it becomes a way of avoiding real problems by redefining them as attitude problems. Zeno's original Stoicism was more radical. His republic imagined a world without conventional institutions where everyone lived according to reason. That's not acceptance of the status quo. That's revolutionary reimagining. Later Stoics did counsel acceptance more, especially Roman Stoics writing under emperors they couldn't oppose. But even they maintained that virtue sometimes requires resistance, that there are things worth fighting for, even if you can't control the outcome. Modern Stoicism often loses this edge. It becomes therapeutic rather than transformative, helping you cope with the world as it is rather than questioning whether the world should be different. This isn't inherent to Stoicism. The resources for social critique are there in the tradition, but it's how the philosophy often gets deployed today. The cosmopolitan vision suffers too. Zeno taught that all humans are fellow citizens of the cosmos, equally rational, equally worthy of moral concern. This was radical in a world divided by city-state loyalties and rigid status hierarchies. It implied duties to strangers, to foreigners, to people you'd never meet. Your circle of concern should be universal. Modern Stoicism mentions this but doesn't emphasize it. The focus is much more individualistic. How do I achieve tranquility? How do I handle my problems? How do I become my best self? The social dimension fades into background noise. Maybe that's just where we are culturally. We're individualistic, therapeutic, focused on personal optimization. We take from traditions what fits our existing orientation. Stoicism gets shaped to match contemporary needs rather than challenging them. Or maybe it's deeper than cultural fit. Maybe certain truths about philosophy have become clear over time. The metaphysical claims, logos pervading the cosmos, fate determining everything, a rational divine principle, these don't hold up to scrutiny. They were products of their time, attempts to make sense of the world with limited knowledge. What survives is the practical wisdom, not because it's separate from the metaphysics, but because it's grounded in observations about human psychology and ethics that remain valid regardless of cosmology. You don't need to believe in cosmic logos to recognize that you can't control external events, but you can control your responses. That's just true, and it's useful. This pragmatic approach lets you take what works without committing to everything. You don't have to buy the whole system. Pick the pieces that help and leave the rest. It's philosophical eclecticism, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as you're honest about what you're doing. The danger is misrepresenting it, claiming you're practicing ancient Stoicism when you're actually doing something quite different, using Zeno's authority to legitimize what's essentially modern self-help. That's intellectual dishonesty dressed as tradition. Better to acknowledge the borrowing openly. Yes, we're taking ideas from Stoicism. Yes, we're adapting them heavily. Yes, the original context was different. No, we don't believe everything Zeno believed. But these concepts are still valuable. They help us navigate our lives more skillfully. That's a defensible position. It respects the tradition without pretending to reproduce it exactly. It allows for creative adaptation while maintaining intellectual honesty about what's happening. What matters ultimately is whether engaging with these ideas makes you wiser, more virtuous, better able to live well. If yes, then the tradition serves its purpose, even in modified form. If no, then perfect historical accuracy won't save it from irrelevance. Zeno wanted to teach people how to live. That was the point of his philosophy. Everything else, the metaphysics, the logic, the physical theory, supported that central concern. How should a human being live? His answer was, according to nature, which means according to reason, which means virtuously. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. External circumstances don't matter, except as opportunities to practice virtue. The wise person remains serene regardless of fortune. That core teaching transcends its original packaging. You can accept it without believing in cosmic logos or fate, or any of the metaphysical apparatus. The ethical insight stands alone. What makes life good is how you respond to circumstances, not the circumstances themselves. Modern Stoicism preserves this insight even when it abandons the rest. That's the thread of continuity that justifies using the name. As long as that central ethical vision remains recognizable, the tradition continues in some meaningful sense. But maybe the question of continuity isn't the right question. Maybe what matters is utility, not genealogy. Philosophy isn't religion. It doesn't require apostolic succession or orthodoxy. Ideas work or they don't. They help or they don't. The pedigree is interesting but ultimately secondary. From this angle, modern Stoicism's relationship to Zeno becomes less fraught. We're not betraying him by adapting his ideas. We're doing exactly what philosophy has always done. Taking what's useful, testing it against experience, modifying it to fit new contexts. That's how traditions stay alive instead of becoming fossils. The alternative is rigid preservation, treating ancient texts as sacred, unchangeable, perfect. But that kills philosophy. It turns living thought into dead doctrine. Zeno wouldn't have wanted that. He broke with his own teachers when their ideas seemed wrong. He synthesized from multiple schools. He created something new while building on what came before. If we're going to honor his legacy, maybe creative adaptation is more faithful than literal reproduction. Maybe the spirit of Stoicism survives better through transformation than through mummification. Still, there's value in knowing what's been changed, in understanding the original context and recognizing how far we've traveled from it. Not to return there necessarily, but to see the distance clearly, to acknowledge what's been gained and what's been lost in translation. What's been gained is accessibility. Ancient Stoicism was demanding, comprehensive, philosophically sophisticated. It required years of study. It asked you to accept a complete worldview. Modern versions lower the barriers. You can engage with Stoic practices without buying the whole system. That opens it to more people. What's been lost is depth, the integration, the sense that ethics, physics, and logic all fit together into a coherent vision. When you extract techniques from their theoretical foundation, they can become shallow, self-help tips instead of philosophical transformation. Ways to optimize your existing life rather than fundamentally rethinking what a good life looks like. Maybe that's an acceptable trade-off. Maybe most people benefit more from accessible practices than from comprehensive philosophy. Maybe it's better to help someone manage anxiety with Stoic techniques than to insist they first master Chrysippus's logic. Practical good outweighs theoretical purity, or maybe we're selling people short. Maybe given the opportunity, more people would engage with the deeper material than we assume. Maybe the dumbing down is unnecessary. Maybe we could present Stoic philosophy in its full complexity while still making it accessible to contemporary audiences. That's the challenge for anyone trying to bridge ancient and modern Stoicism. How do you honor the tradition's depth while making it relevant to people who don't share its metaphysical assumptions? How do you preserve what's essential while adapting what's contingent? There's no single answer. Different approaches serve different needs. Some people want quick tools for stress management. Others want comprehensive life philosophy. Some need permission to grieve. Others need reminders about what they can control. The tradition is rich enough to support multiple interpretations. What matters is honesty, being clear about what you're doing. If you're teaching Stoic techniques divorced from Stoic metaphysics, say so. If you're adapting the tradition for modern therapeutic purposes, acknowledge the adaptation. If you're trying to reconstruct ancient practice as faithfully as possible, explain your methodology. Don't pretend one approach is the only legitimate one. The conversation between ancient and modern will continue. New generations will discover Zeno, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus. They'll find things that speak to their particular moment. They'll adapt, modify, reinterpret. The tradition will keep evolving because that's what living traditions do. And somewhere in there, Zeno's core insight persists, the one that transcends all the philosophical apparatus and cultural context. You have a choice about how you respond to what happens to you. That choice is where your freedom and dignity lie. Everything else is details. Whether you call it Stoicism or something else, whether you believe in Logos or not, whether you practice it as he taught or in heavily modified form, that central truth remains. It's been discovered and rediscovered across cultures and centuries because it maps onto something real about human experience. That's Zeno's lasting contribution, not the specific doctrines, most of which are forgotten or rejected. Not the school he founded, which eventually died out, but the ethical vision at the heart of it all. The recognition that virtue is the only true good, that character matters more than circumstances, that reason can guide us to better lives. These ideas didn't start with Zeno. He inherited them from Socrates and the Cynics, but he articulated them in ways that proved remarkably durable. He created a framework that others could build on, modify, extend. He started a conversation that's still happening 23 centuries later. That's more than most philosophers achieve. Most are forgotten within a generation. Their books gather dust. Their ideas seem dated and irrelevant. The fact that we're still engaging with Zeno's thought, still finding value in it, still arguing about what it means and how to apply it, that's the ultimate validation. He wanted to teach people how to live. That was the goal. Everything else served that purpose. And if people are still learning from his ideas, still finding wisdom in them, still using them to navigate their lives more skillfully, then his project succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. The man himself remains shadowy. We know the outline of his life, a few anecdotes, some fragments of his writing. The rest is speculation and reconstruction. He left no autobiography, no personal letters, no diary. Just the philosophical system that bore his name and the tradition he founded. Maybe that's how he would have wanted it, the ideas mattering more than the person, the teaching outlasting the teacher, anonymity in service of truth. Or maybe he was just unlucky. Maybe his writings were lost in the chaos of history. Maybe he would have preferred to be remembered more fully, as a complete human being, rather than just a name attached to doctrines. We'll never know. What we're left with is the philosophy, the system he built, the school he founded, the influence that radiated outward through the centuries. That's his real legacy, not the biographical details, but the thought itself. And that thought keeps proving useful. People in completely different circumstances, facing completely different challenges, find guidance in Stoic principles. The Roman slave and the Roman emperor, medieval monks and Renaissance humanists, modern executives and modern prisoners, all finding something valuable in the same basic ideas. That's remarkable. It suggests these aren't just cultural artifacts, interesting only as historical curiosities. They're insights into something universal about human experience, about the challenges we face, the choices we make, the meaning we create. Zeno glimpsed these truths and articulated them in ways that resonated. He created tools that others could use. He started a tradition that adapted and survived because it addressed real needs, solved real problems, helped real people live better. Whether modern Stoicism is true to his vision is less important than whether it serves the same purpose, whether it helps people face difficulty with courage, respond to circumstances with wisdom, treat others with justice, live with integrity. If it does, then the tradition continues regardless of how much has changed. If it doesn't, then perfect historical accuracy won't make it worthwhile. The test isn't fidelity to ancient doctrine, it's practical results. Does engaging with these ideas make you better, wiser, more capable of living well? If yes, then Stoicism works. If no, then something needs to change. That's a very Stoic way to evaluate the tradition. Practical, focused on results, willing to adapt based on what actually helps. Zeno would recognize the approach, even if he'd be puzzled by much of the content. In the end, we're all doing our best to live wisely in the circumstances we find ourselves in. That was Zeno's project too. He had the advantage of creating a system from scratch. We have the advantage of 23 centuries of refinement, criticism, adaptation. Neither position is obviously superior. What matters is that the conversation continues, that each generation engages seriously with these questions about how to live, what to value, how to respond to fortune and misfortune. Whether we call it Stoicism or something else, whether we trace it to Zeno or acknowledge multiple sources, the underlying project remains. Philosophy in its original sense. Not academic theorizing, but the pursuit of wisdom. Not solving abstract puzzles, but learning to live well. Not building systems for their own sake, but creating frameworks that help us navigate existence more skillfully. That's what Zeno was after. That's what the tradition he founded aimed at. And that's what justifies continued engagement with these ideas. Not because they're old, or because a particular ancient philosopher taught them, but because they still help with the fundamental task of being human. A man who lost everything in a shipwreck ended up teaching the world how to lose everything gracefully. That's the simple version. The complicated version is that Zeno of Citium spent 50 years developing a philosophical system that would outlive empires, influence religions, and resurface in therapist offices 23 centuries later, disguised as cognitive behavioral therapy. The trajectory is strange when you map it out. Phoenician merchant becomes cynic student, becomes philosophical innovator, becomes Athenian celebrity, becomes suicide at 72 over a broken toe. Each transition seems improbable until you realize they're all expressions of the same core conviction. That reason should govern life. That virtue is the only thing that truly matters. That everything else is just noise. His death especially bothers people. Modern readers want to explain it away, contextualize it, maybe suggest he was depressed or impulsive, but that's imposing our categories onto someone who operated from completely different premises. For Zeno, choosing when to die wasn't fundamentally different from choosing what to eat. Both are judgments about what's appropriate given the circumstances. Neither is intrinsically good or evil. This sounds cold until you remember what Stoicism actually claimed. External events, health, wealth, life, death, don't determine whether you're flourishing. Your character does, your virtue does, your ability to respond rationally to whatever happens. If that's true, then treating death as this ultimate tragedy that must be avoided at all costs makes no sense. It's just another external event, no better or worse than anything else. The Athenians apparently agreed. They gave him a public funeral, erected monuments, passed decrees. No scandal attached to how he died. The ancient world took a more pragmatic view of these things. Sometimes death is the appropriate response. Sometimes continuing is. The wise person recognizes which is which. But here's what's harder to defend: the gap between Zeno's radical vision and his actual teaching. His republic abolished institutions, currencies, gender hierarchies, everyone equal, living according to pure reason, no laws necessary because crime wouldn't exist. That's revolutionary. is also completely disconnected from the advice he actually gave students, which was basically how to be virtuous within existing structures, how to respond well to circumstances, not how to transform them. This tension never gets resolved. Later Stoics inherited it, struggled with it, mostly came down on the side of acceptance rather than revolution. By the Roman period, Stoicism had become the philosophy of the establishment. Senators and emperors practicing it, using it to justify their positions as much as to critique them. The radical edge got filed down, smoothed over, made safe. Modern Stoicism continues this pattern. The therapeutic focus, the emphasis on individual psychology, the techniques for managing stress, none of this is revolutionary. It's accommodationist. It helps you cope with the world as it is rather than questioning whether the world should be different. You can argue this is appropriate. Most people, most of the time, need tools for dealing with immediate problems, not grand visions of social transformation. Stoic techniques genuinely help with anxiety, anger, grief. That's valuable, regardless of whether it maintains the status quo. But you can also argue it's a betrayal, that Zeno's vision was bigger than stress management, that reducing Stoicism to life hacks misses the point. That philosophy should challenge us, not just comfort us. Both positions have merit. The question is what you think philosophy is for. If it's meant to help individuals navigate their lives more skillfully, modern Stoicism succeeds. If it's meant to critique society and imagine alternatives, modern Stoicism fails. Maybe the answer is that philosophy should do both, that the tension between accommodation and critique is productive rather than problematic. You need tools for living within systems while also questioning whether those systems are just. Stoicism provides resources for both, though modern versions emphasize one side heavily. The metaphysics question won't go away either. Can you practice Stoicism without believing in cosmic logos, fate, divine reason? Depends what you mean by practice. You can use Stoic techniques, you can adopt Stoic attitudes, but are you actually being a Stoic if you reject the worldview that grounds everything? Zeno would probably say no. The physics and ethics are inseparable. You understand how to live by understanding how reality works. Remove the foundation, and you're left with practices that might produce results, but don't constitute wisdom. Modern practitioners would probably say yes. The techniques work regardless of metaphysical commitments. What matters is outcomes, not theoretical consistency. If distinguishing between what you control and what you don't help you manage anxiety, who cares whether you believe in cosmic reason? This pragmatic approach is very contemporary, very American actually. Take what works, discard what doesn't. Don't worry about coherence. It's philosophically unsatisfying, but practically effective, which is ironic because the Stoics themselves were supposed to be the practical philosophers, focused on ethics over abstract theorizing. Now they're the ones being accused of excessive theorizing, while modern adaptations strip theory away entirely. What survives all this transformation is something harder to define. Not specific doctrines, not the complete system, but a sensibility, a way of approaching experience that emphasizes reason, self-control, acceptance of what can't be changed, focus on what matters. That sensibility shows up in Marcus Aurelius's meditations, in Epictetus's discourses, in Seneca's letters, and yes, in modern self-help books that mention Stoicism without understanding it deeply. It's diluted compared to what Zeno taught, but dilution isn't always bad. Sometimes ideas need to be watered down to spread. The pure concentrate reaches fewer people than the accessible version. You can lament the loss of depth while acknowledging the gain in reach. The alternative is preservation at the cost of relevance, keeping Stoicism exactly as Zeno taught it, metaphysics and all, which would make it interesting to classicists and useless to everyone else, or adapting it so thoroughly that the name becomes misleading, a marketing term attached to something only distantly related to ancient philosophy. We're probably somewhere between those extremes. Modern Stoicism maintains enough continuity to justify the label while changing enough to remain relevant. Whether that balance is right depends on your priorities: historical accuracy or contemporary utility, theoretical coherence or practical help, depth or accessibility. The debate will continue because there's no neutral position. Every interpretation makes choices about what to emphasize and what to minimize. Every adaptation reflects contemporary concerns, whether it acknowledges them or not. The question isn't whether to interpret, but how consciously and honestly you do it. What remains undeniable is that a shipwrecked merchant from Cyprus created something durable. The specific details have shifted. The metaphysical framework has collapsed. The radical social vision has been domesticated. But something persists. Something about focusing on what's within your power, about responding virtuously regardless of circumstances, about living according to reason rather than passion. These ideas keep proving useful across wildly different contexts: Roman slaves and emperors, medieval monks and Renaissance humanists, modern CEOs and modern prisoners, all finding guidance in the same basic framework. That's not accident. That's evidence that Zeno identified something real about human experience and human possibility. He wasn't the first to identify it. Socrates was there before him. The Cynics were there. But Zeno articulated it in ways that proved remarkably portable. He created a system robust enough to survive its own metaphysical foundations crumbling. He started a tradition that could adapt without losing its essential character. That's rare. Most philosophical systems are brittle. They depend on assumptions that don't survive contact with new knowledge or different cultural contexts. Stoicism bent instead of breaking. It absorbed challenges, incorporated criticisms, evolved while maintaining recognizable continuity. The man himself remains mostly unknown. We have anecdotes, fragments, reconstructions. We know he was lean and dark and ate figs. We know he studied with crates and broke with cynic shamelessness. We know he taught in a colonnade for decades. We know he chose to die after breaking his toe. The rest is inference and speculation. Maybe that's fitting. The philosophy mattered more than the philosopher. The teaching outlasted the teacher. The tradition transcended its founder. Zeno would probably approve. He wasn't building a personality cult. He was articulating truths about how to live. Whether those truths remain true is what each generation must decide for itself. The answers change, the circumstances change, but the questions persist. How should we respond to what we cannot control? What makes a life good? How do we maintain integrity when everything's falling apart? These aren't historical curiosities, they're permanent features of human existence. Stoicism offers one set of answers, not the only answers, not perfect answers, but answers that have helped millions of people across 2 millennia face difficulty with courage and respond to fortune with wisdom. That's Zeno's legacy. Not the doctrines themselves, but the framework they provide. Not the complete system, but the tools for living. 23 centuries after his death, we're still using those tools, still adapting them, still arguing about what they mean and how to apply them. The conversation continues because the questions remain urgent and the answers remain incomplete. That's what philosophy is supposed to do. Not solve everything permanently, but provide resources for ongoing engagement with the fundamental challenges of being human.